listening to the Hazard Ground podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zinno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week. Before we get to this week's guest, a former Marine with an incredible story where he was set up to take the fall for war crimes in Afghanistan that he didn't commit. It's just an unreal tale, and the book about it. We'll get to that coming up in just a moment. First, our normal set of announcements. Make sure you follow us on all the social media sites, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, at Hazard Ground Podcast. As well, please continue with our Amazon promotion. Go to our website, hazardground.com. Click on the Amazon button at the bottom of the homepage or under the sponsors tab. It'll redirect you to Amazon. You do all of your normal Amazon shopping. We get a percentage of what you guys spend. We'll donate a percentage of that back to some of the great charities and organizations featured here on the show. And it also works from your smartphone as well. It redirects you right to the app. Credit card information saved. Very useful, very easy. And of course, continue to leave us Apple 5-star reviews. Helps grow the show. Love to hear from you guys. Subscribe to the YouTube channel as well. You can watch all the episodes there. So a lot of ways for you guys to consume the Hazard Ground. All right, on to this week's guest. Spent over 26 years in the United States Marine Corps, 10 and a half of that inside special operations. He's got 10 total deployments and also commanded FAST, the Fleet Anti-Security Team, and was in Benghazi right after the fall of Benghazi back in 2012. But his story today is about his unit in Afghanistan that was ambushed and then was accused of killing Afghan civilians. It went through one of the highest courts, one of the biggest trials in all of American military history. He was eventually exonerated, but still ran into more problems with the Marine Corps going forward. His story here to detail that in a book called A Few Bad Men. Major Fred Galvin, retired, joining us here on the Hazard Ground podcast. Fred, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here, Mark. Thank you very much for having me.
Amazing career. And full disclosure to the audience, saw you on LinkedIn, read your profile. I'm like, that's a dude I want to talk to. Not only because of your Marine career and everything you did, but, again, I joked at the top about, working for Tesla, but it's got to be pretty incredible to go from the Marines to a company like that, and have that as your 9 to 5, so to speak.
Yes, very humbled to be with a company like Tesla, and the leaders that I have are very, very aggressive, just like in the Marine Corps. So it's a great organization with a great mission, and loved working there. That's for sure.
Go back to the beginning for me. How and why'd you get in the Marine Corps?
Okay, so when I was about a 10-year-old boy, our family took a trip to the Middle East, to the East Coast battlefields of America, the Revolutionary and Civil Wars, and hearing this tale spoken to us by our park rangers, that was, to me, one of the most profound experiences I had in my life at that time. So at that time, I didn't know anything about the military. We didn't live around any military bases. We didn't have anybody in our family in the military, but I knew that's what I wanted to do, is to serve. And then it was later on in high school, one of the fellow students, he'd mentioned, if you want to go into the military, you got to join the Marines because they're the first to fight. So that really gained my attention and made me want to join the Marines, which I did right after graduating high school. And 17 years old, a week after high school, I was in boot camp. So dream came true for me.
Were you the kind of guy who did a lot of reading, or you sort of went into it blind? Did you try to do your research about what the Marines were about and what boot camp was like and everything else, or you just sort of walked into it knowing I'm going to be a Marine and that's good enough for me?
I didn't do any reading other than listening to this peer, and he quickly, connected me with the recruiter, and the recruiter kind of sold me exactly what I wanted to hear. Everything about the Marines was close-knit organization, first to fight. I was sold. I was a student athlete in high school, so this organization, this recruiter, he was an All-American football player when he was in high school, and he was an infantry Marine, so he was a big, huge guy. And that's what I pictured in the Marines. So he had his work totally cut out for him with me.
When you get to boot camp, are you shocked at sort of, is it difficult for you? Are you surprised to see what the whole thing is about?
Actually, not to make any negative statement against the Marine Corps, but it was just what I wanted. Having been an athlete, playing football and track very competitively, I enjoyed boot camp. Thought it was not the most physically challenging, but there was, and the little mining games. For some people, I think they're battling homesickness. I don't know if they fully knew what they were getting into. Some of what they're doing there, I found funny. Like they're playing some games, and the drill instructors really, they're not going to kill you. So it was, to me, it was very enjoyable. Later on, throughout my career, you get into special operations, force reconnaissance, and in Marine special operations, that training was actually much more challenging mentally and physically than anything I had previously done at earlier stages of my career.
So this is the late 80s when you sign up. And, without fast forwarding too much, the Gulf War comes around in the early 90s. Did you miss that whole experience?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I deployed, I was about 20 years old, deployed with the Regimental Landing Team 5. That's a Marine Air Ground Task Force that we deployed out of Camp Pendleton, California, and went to offloaded in Saudi Arabia, Jabal Ali, and then went into Kuwait. Had limited combat there in Al-Khachi and Al-Wafra, and then as you know, the war was over very quickly. And a lot of people make light of what that combat operation was all about, but it literally was the last where from beginning to end it was a successful operation. I would submit what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan was very successful all the way up until 2005. And then when in May of 2006, we had the Afghan president, Hamid Karzai, meet in the White House with President Bush, and they decided to have a plan to develop a democratic state inside Afghanistan. And then that's when Generals Petraeus and Mattis penned the counterinsurgency strategy. And from that point on, there was a decline. It is what it is. There was assessments going on, statistics were skewed, and comments were made by many general officers to Congress, which the facts were very distorted. And that's unfortunately was the beginning of the end. Before that, what was happening in Afghanistan was extremely successful. Those frontline foot soldiers were doing their jobs, winning the war, dropping bombs. The Taliban was in retreat. And then after that, even the counterinsurgency strategy, they hijacked this phrase from the Hippocratic Oath of first do no harm. Tell me that doesn't send mixed signals to those frontline troops.
We're in combat, but please do no harm, for crying out loud. Because that makes a whole lot of sense.
Yes. So.
But hey, we got the fancy term coin out of it, as in counterinsurgency. So that got somebody an award somewhere high up in the Pentagon for coming up with that phrase. Different conversation, though. Let me ask you, going back to your experience in the Gulf, you had this romantic notion of what the Marines are like and serving and being in combat and everything else. During the first Gulf War, did any of that sort of fall short, or did it meet your expectations, or did you fulfill sort of this, hey, I've reached the pinnacle sort of deal of what I wanted to do?
That's a very interesting conversation. Mixed emotions. For me, it led me as a very young Marine. I was a corporal. I thought we were trained, but we were not as well trained as we could have and should have been. I kind of made a commitment to myself at that time that if I was ever a leader in the Marines, I would make sure that the troops I was in charge of were as well trained as they could possibly be. And that led me, afterwards, I went to college there in California, just south of the base at Cal State San Marcos. Then worked as a stockbroker at Smith Barney for 2 years and re-entered the Marine Corps as a commissioned officer. Started out in the infantry, then went over to force reconnaissance. And that whole experience as a leader, first in the infantry and then force reconnaissance and special operations, allowed me to be able to train the Marines to the best of my ability. It was very entrepreneurial. You had a lot of leeway to train your Marines as you saw fit for the mission that you were going to do. So really, really did enjoy that. Desert Storm, was a time when not only the military was united and cohesive, but the American people were, and that's how it started off right after 9/11. Mm-hmm. And then I would say right now, especially after the events of last year, right before 9/11 and our withdrawal from Afghanistan and how that was
botched.
Executed. Yes.
You can say it. I've said it a million times. I'm still in uniform. I don't think anybody's going to argue. So
yeah, it
was a show.
When Afghans are dangling from an Air Force C-17, and that has consequences. We've seen what's happened since then with the Russian army invading Ukraine. You see 31 ballistic missile launches just this calendar year from North Korea. You see larger scale and more frequent amphibious operations off of the east coast of China by the People's Liberation Army and People's Liberation Army Navy. Last month, this exercise, Sniper Frontier, just 1,700 miles off the Florida coast in the Caribbean Sea. Let's not remember the Monroe Doctrine, but we have this activity hosted by President Maduro of Venezuela, who invited 13 countries to include Russia, Iran, China, right here in our front yard. So those are the consequences when we're perceived militarily as weak as our adversaries look at us. It has consequences.
Yeah, the Monroe Doctrine, the world's worst HOA. Now that you look at it, at least nobody's paying attention to it, right? So different conversation again. I'm curious about that sort of seminal leadership moment for you where, you felt, as you mentioned before, you weren't being trained the way you were, and you decided, hey, now I'm going to flip the script. Instead of being the led, I want to be the leader. In that moment, and in going through all that, when you look back on it, did you sort of meet your own objectives for what you wanted to do? Because always that's, you get this moment where the switch goes on or the light goes on for you and you're like, hey, now I want to be the one who's calling the shots and be able to sort of affect things in a different manner. And then you go back and grade yourself on that, so to speak. So did you feel like you were able to sort of be the leader you wanted to become?
Very much so. That's one thing the Marine Corps does very well is it trains its infantry officers and small unit leaders. But as a lieutenant, you were given the unit that I was in. At a company commander, he did allow us to have a lot of time on our schedule to go out and conduct a lot of field training. And our battalion commander encouraged the same thing. They actually demanded that you spend no less than 10 days out of the month in the field, not just going to the field, but in the field. And that type of leadership, they were very inspirational. They did what they could during the end of the Clinton years when there was severe cutbacks in the military. We were doing a lot of blank fire training because ammunition, the Marine Corps does not have these massive programs to the same extent as the United States Air Force or the Navy. But what we do have was cut, and but we were allowed to at least go out in the field and do a lot of maneuver, which was very good for myself in developing the Marines that I was in charge of. So later on, I think that had a lot of success. Later on with different administrations and being in force reconnaissance, I did a tour there as a platoon commander overseas for 3 years before instructor duty at the Marine Corps' version of Top Gun out in Yuma, Arizona, which to me was great, because they did provide a lot of resources to train Marines, both air and ground. I was the guy on the ground, deconflicting and controlling fires for aviation and surface fires out there in these very large, complex exercises with many joint aviation platforms from all the different joint services, which that was instrumental in preparing me for what would come later on in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. So what I had wanted with as far as training, I did get it in spades. It just happened a little bit later in my career. And I'm very thankful that I was able to have those types of opportunities, which a lot of people, is very, very few numbers of infantry officers are allowed to go and be an instructor. Very selective out there in the Marines Aviation Weapons and Tactics Instructor Squadron.
Are you in special operations by the time 9/11 rolls around?
So I had been a Force Recon platoon commander all the way up until the summer of 2001. And that was, so the Marine Corps they did not have any active component in the Special Operations Command. That's kind of an interesting bit of history, that the Marine Corps, everybody says, oh, you guys were late to the start. Well, before the Special Operations Command even existed, you did have the Marine Raiders in World War II, which the Marines did not want. They started in 1942, lasted until 1944 while the war was still going on, and these Raiders were still fighting in the South Pacific. The Commandant of the Marine Corps said it is not in the best interest of the Marine Corps to have an elite with an elite, and General Vandergrift signed disbanding the Marine Raiders. So that's one data point. The second, as you mentioned, with this 2001 timeframe. So if you roll it back even further to 1987, when they stood up the Special Operations Command in the United States, all of the Army Green Berets, Rangers, Air Force Special Operations, Navy SEALs were also drawn into it. The Marine Corps said, hey, if I'm going to pay for this beer, I'm going to drink it here. And the last thing the Marine Corps wanted was to man, train, and equip elite units and not be able to employ them and have them employed by the Navy or the Army or another joint force commander. So smart business proposal. However, to answer your question in a long-winded way, the Marine Corps was like, no, we still believe, like in World War II, it's not in the best interest to have elite within elite. We are a small unit. We don't have a lot of money. And if we have these elite units and we have to pay for them because of Title 10, they have to fund them by the service, we are not going to have them work for another commander. So it wasn't until after 9/11 that Dr. Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense on his second time as Secretary of Defense, he was, as you know, a naval officer. He was Secretary of Defense right at the end of the Vietnam War. And he, very smart man, he understood how effective the Green Berets, Navy SEALs, these elite units were. So he directed that all the services increase their capacity for special operations. He even told that to the Marines. The Marines slow rolled with this proof of concept called Marine Corps Special Operations Command Detachment 1. The Marines are into these big, long acronyms that make it sound like it's another item on the McDonald's menu. So
exactly. Yeah.
MC SOCOM Det 1, they did a proof of concept. It was supposed to be for 2 years. They deployed with SEALs to Afghanistan, did great work, and then they came back, extended it for a year, slow rolling Donald Rumsfeld's effort to have a Marine component activated. I'm sure some in the Marine Corps and senior leadership positions thought that Bush 43 would be a one-term president like his father. That did not occur. He was reelected. And soon thereafter, in 2005, the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, ordered the Marine Corps, thou shalt create a Special Operations Command. So when that happened in 2006, I was still in Force Recon there on the West Coast as a platoon commander. We had been doing multiple deployments in Force Recon with the Marine Corps in support of the Marine Corps' combat efforts in Western Iraq. And then they activated the Special Operations Command for the Marines. I was pulled from the West Coast in Camp Pendleton to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, where I served there as the first Marine Special Operations Company commanding officer, and we deployed as a task force on the USS Bataan. For the year prior to that, we didn't know where we were going to go. It was back and forth, Iraq, Afghanistan, maybe even the Horn of Africa. Got on the ship. A week afterwards, after getting on the ship, they told us we were going to go to Afghanistan, which, if you recall, in 2006, there was full-page ads taken out in the New York Times, hit ads going into a presidential general election saying general betray us. So there's this surge going on in Iraq that was very unpopular in America. A lot of Americans were being wounded and killed. So we thought, because the Marines had pulled all of their forces out of Afghanistan and sent every last Marine into Iraq, and that's what that was the U.S. military's focus of effort. So we thought we were going to go there, did most of our training for combat operations in Iraq, and then all of a sudden we pivoted and went into Afghanistan.
Right.
So we got off the ship in Djibouti, in the Horn of Africa, flew in, landed. They put us in a location that the French Special Operations had just withdrawn from in the eastern portion of Afghanistan in Jalalabad. Very politically sensitive area. You have people that in that town versus many other parts of Afghanistan were educated, and that was a passage point. As you know, and many of your listeners, we were not allowed to go into Pakistan. So what you had going on at that time was the enemy quickly realized that became a training sanctuary, and no longer did the Taliban need to summit, the 14,000 foot snow-covered mountains. At least when we arrived in February, they were snow-covered. Because America, we built the first paved road in Afghanistan that connected the capitals between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So that served many purposes for the Taliban, and not just the average Afghan, but the Taliban could export poppy and opium very quickly out of Afghanistan to fund and fuel the war. And this training sanctuary that was just on the other side of the border was very accessible now by road, so they could import foreign fighters. And the first village on the Afghanistan side is a town called Badi Ko. And let's just think, if you were like what I do in Tesla, you're in distribution, consider this akin to what Amazon calls a fulfillment center. This is a big logistics or distribution node where product like suicide bombers and jihadists link up with their handlers for that final mile service to get their jihad on in Kandahar, Kabul, Sangin, Herat, you name it. So we entered this village on the 4th of March in 2007. It was actually our 30th mission. And when we entered that village that morning, we could tell the baseline had changed from just 3 hours prior, where it was a normal pattern of life, hustle and bustle with men, women, children, the market, bazaar. And we knew this, that when there is a mass exodus of women and children, that sends signals to your brain something is about ready to happen, and it definitely did. So we saw everybody lining up on both sides of the road. These were only fighting age men. And then also that sent triggers in us. Okay, something's about ready to happen. I announced that over the radio. Then we got hit with a car bomb. It was a van filled with fuel and mortar rounds that produced shrapnel that blasted three-dimensionally. This is the largest suicide explosive device that I had ever seen. It went off right on the front of our patrol. We immediately stopped, got into our formation. Marines are taught, how to react to combat. So we did a counterattack. The first thing that hit us after that car bomb was a van on our left flank on the south side of the road. This sports utility vehicle had 3 jihadists hanging out the windows, firing AK-47s fully automatic at the team that had just gotten hit. Luckily, the gunner in the turret of that vehicle, he was knocked down. He was on fire. He only had shrapnel in his right bicep. He stood up, manned his medium machine gun. He aimed in. That was a vehicle that we use as our ambulance because it had an open back container. So the good thing is nobody in that vehicle was killed because it had an open back container. We had a young Marine in the back also. He stood to his feet. He had a light machine gun. They both aimed in and shot at those who were firing at us in that sports utility vehicle, killed them. The driver bailed out into a ditch where he later continued to fight against us with his AK-47. He later testified against us in the court almost a year later via video teleconference from an American base in Afghanistan. He was paid salacious payments by, the local battle space commander for those 3 jihadists that were killed. This was a known terrorist on terrorist list that the Army battle space commander stated that his task force intel officer vetted, but not according to the intel reports that were produced for the court during the court. So either that was a bold-faced lie or somebody didn't do the proper due diligence and should be held accountable for that, especially since a senior Army officer paid the average of 4 years salary for an Afghan to a key terrorist, a known terrorist, for 3 other jihadists that were fighting at us. So we quickly killed them, as I said, Mark. Then we quickly turned our attention to the right side of the road on the north, where we had dismounted jihadists in formation. So they were doing fire maneuver. So one echelon would provide suppressive fire while the other would bound towards us. This was in a dry riverbed. So, many people said, well, you probably fired it and there's some civilians killed. And I'm like, hey, hold on. This was at 9:00 in the morning, not fog of war. I was on the patrol. I saw it with my own eyes. I made a sworn statement, as all 30 of us did. I made up, a polygraph from the president of the American Polygraph Association. That was all given to the convening authority. So let me explain a little bit about what happened. What didn't happen is that the suicide bomber detonated. That was the only the only body that was evidence of a body that was found is the headless torso of that suicide bomber. But the sports utility vehicle that was driving at us, that had the jihadists shooting at us, they didn't find any bodies in that vehicle. It was shot up. That was a picture that was taken by the New York Times and blasted out all over the international media. So a little bit about that. That vehicle was driving down an unimproved trail. There was nobody, so it was coming to T-bone our vehicle that just got hit. So the fields of fire were directly at that vehicle. It wasn't spraying into this crowded market. The contact that we engaged in the dry riverbed on the north side of the road, that was exactly what I just mentioned. It was a dry riverbed that was filled with jihadists. So yes, there could have been people killed with the shrapnel from the car bomb. There could have been civilians killed by the jihadists that were firing at the direction where we were at, where there was people lined up on the road. But they were not civilians killed by those in our patrol firing at those in this depression down in that dry riverbed. But we remained in that kill zone for a total of 5 minutes.
Which is forever.
Which is forever if you're getting, and we were receiving sniper fire from this mountain that hit our vehicles that the U.S. Army's Criminal Investigative Division later did a analysis on and found that the impacts were assessed to be from a Soviet Dragunov sniper rifle. Because as crazy as it sounds, the Special Operations Command Central, in charge of all the Special Operations Forces in the Middle East, they sent an Air Force colonel to be the investigating officer. And Mark, I know you would never likely be the subject matter expert called to investigate an AC-130 or any Air Force aircraft mishap. It was a total wrong match, but that's what had happened. And this Air Force colonel, with his vast zero combat experience, assessed that the damage to our vehicles, those impacts, was either from the car bomb, even after the Task Force Paladin, which Task Force Paladin does all these post-blast analysis. They were immediately on the scene. They examined our vehicles and they assessed that the impacts from our vehicles were from, projectiles from direct fire weapons. So the Air Force Colonel Prahana, attempted to go to the Sergeant First Class on multiple occasions and have him change his report. That Sergeant First Class testified to that in the court in January 2008, that he was coerced multiple times, but he never changed his report. But he stated the Air Force Colonel wanted him to do that. Air Force Colonel stated that he opined with his great experience that we either shot our vehicles before the patrol. We voluntarily, Mark, you've been in the Army. You've probably never heard of anybody doing pre-combat inspections and checks, trying to impact the armor of your own vehicles to.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Let me see if my armor works by firing at it before we get outside the wire. Yeah,
yes. And then his other opinion was that during the patrol, we were spooked, so that, we were in column on this patrol, ducks in a row, vehicles right behind each other. So he was saying that the Marines on the patrol either shot at ourselves, or that the Marine in the back troop compartment in that vehicle shot the side of our own vehicle. So you used machine guns, and I don't know if you've ever heard of a technique that when you're in an ambush, if you just got blown up, that you would use a medium or light machine gun and reach out over the side of your vehicle, pulling the trigger and firing at your own side of the vehicle, instead of at 9 o'clock in the morning where you clearly see what's going on, aiming in at any threats and being prepared to address those threats. So this lunacy was further perpetuated where the convening authority, where the Air Force investigator made his report. They turned it over to the convening authority, which was Major General Frank Kearney at that time. He turned it over to the Marine Corps, and the Marine Corps didn't have the special operations, the MARSOC component, be the convening authority. They turned it over to the conventional side, which the convening authority was then Lieutenant General Jim Mattis, who, when I was relieved after they kicked us out of Afghanistan, we went to Kuwait. Our commanding officer believed the reports of these Afghans who said that we were drunk, that we were. That's the first thing our commanding officer asked my battalion commander was, "Is it true that you guys were drunk?" So he believed not any of us who were his own Marines, who he had known for over a year as we were training, and we reported to him. But the Afghan locals had said that the Marines were drunk, that we use, I don't know if you ever heard of this technique, Mark, it's probably the stupidest thing you ever heard, but the Afghan locals, the tribal elders, were saying that we use slingshots and hand grenades. So I've never heard this military technique or procedure where, why would you pull a pin out of a hand grenade and try to jerry it into a slingshot and fire it from a vehicle at the Taliban? They said we were trying to make it look like there was an explosion, but that there was no explosion. But our leaders wanted to believe this. And unfortunately, and sadly, they did. They did believe it. This is unfortunate. And that was the beginning of the end. And, that's when they dogpiled us. We were sent to back to the United States, and they assigned 45 criminal investigators, 4 prosecuting attorneys against us. And this turned into against 7 of us, 2 of us, finally, myself and one other Marine commissioned officer, went in the courtroom, turned into the longest trial for a war crime during the entire Afghan war. They put a gag order against us. The Marine Corps doesn't call it a gag order. They call it a protective order that says we couldn't say anything to the media. Even our attorneys, if they did, they would be disbarred. I have a copy of that order here. Mm-hmm. And so this violates, as you know, Mark, when you and I took an oath we took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. The First Amendment of that is, that we have free speech. Having any form of censure why would we, for our own protection, not want to say anything to the press? Right. We saw how a year ago the Marine Corps did this again by trying to suppress, and I know it's a totally different situation with the former Lieutenant Colonel Stu Scheller, but they don't want information getting out that makes the Marine Corps look bad.
Right.
They put that gag order against us, and we complied with it, and it had some negative consequences because when we went into the courtroom, as you know, the military, when it's authorized, can conduct information operations. An information operation is an operation that distorts the truth. It's meant to change the enemy's perspective and to our advantage. So when we started this court case in January 2008, this unfortunately was an information operation where every defense witness, what I just described to you, Mark, was a gun battle. It was not Jason Bourne's knock list. It was not locations of submarines at sea. There's no reason to classify any of this. But not only were the defense witnesses that had exculpatory evidence, all that testimony was in, they'd go to classified sessions. So the media was escorted out of the courtroom, not in the lobby. They put them 2 buildings over. So they couldn't hear anything, in not just with defense witnesses, but with character witnesses. These are Marine officers, senior Marine officers, but they had never been to Afghanistan. So they had no classified information. They were just talking about my character. Mm-hmm. Again, the media was escorted out during their testimony, which that type of information operation, one, it's unlawful to have for 3.5 weeks, longest trial. This is not coincidental. You can't say that happened when there's 45 witnesses and all of our defense witnesses. This ritual would go on again and again and again. So although the jury in the military, we call it a panel, those jury members were able to see, hear, and understand and make a decision, which we were acquitted and exonerated. But the media does what the media does. And when they get information, although it may be limited, although it may be only one side, they're going to report just that. And that's what happened. So, yes, we were kind of labeled with this black cloud.
Right.
And although I went back to work, continued to serve for 7 more years until I reached a service limitation, I wasn't able to get promoted because this, they didn't use legal terms. Mark, you've been in the military, you're in the military, you've been in military justice cases where when your senior enlisted advisor hands you the document when you're doing a military justice case, and there's 3 choices that you have to adjudicate that case. It's either the individual is innocent, they are guilty, or the case is dismissed. You don't use verbiage like you would in an after action for some exercise by saying you acted appropriately. So those mealy-mouthed words allowed the press to continue to perpetuate this false narrative that we had killed Afghan civilians, and which was totally false. And but that label stuck, and
right.
So I was ordered to go to a board of inquiry, which they set. Within 30 days, I just got married. They immediately notified me via my attorney on my honeymoon. This is all in the book, A Few Bad Men.
Yeah.
So they, again, continue with this type of psychological operations and information warfare to psych you out, saying, hey, you get back here immediately from your honeymoon. You have 30 days. You're going to this involuntary separation board. So the Marine Corps intended to direct its fire directly at the leaders, holding us. They wanted to hold us accountable. This was embarrassing. The first time Marines had ever been kicked out of theater. Yes, it was. It's very important that this type of situation that occurred gets exposed, so the American public knows that our military is critical, especially at this time where we have resurgent forces developing technology and building forces that are highly capable. Our U.S. military forces must be well equipped, well trained by competent commanders. And right now we have some issues with this case. Definitely showed some weaknesses that in our U.S. military. I mean, you read the book A Few Bad Men, and it took me 11 years to fight to get the Special Operations Command and the Marine Corps to declassify the information and release it to me. I'm talking the courtroom testimony. There's no reason to classify it. It has now been declassified. It's in the book. So when you read this and people are shocked, like, I had no idea. People that I even served with that were in our Marine Special Operations Task Force, their comments were, I didn't know all that. And that's a shame. I was interviewed after the release of the book by the former National Security Advisor, and he said, I didn't know this was going on. So this type of censorship did accomplish its purpose in keeping it from the American public, even senior leaders in the U.S. government. That's illegal. That should not be going on. When you're intending to cover something up, as you know from the Security Classification Guide, it is against regulations to utilize security classification to save someone from embarrassment. We're not allowed to do something like that. And this is not the first time it has happened where the truth was distorted, as you know, by senior military leaders. In the Patrick Tillman case, Army
of course.
Corporal in the U.S. Army Rangers, they created a false narrative and they sold it, unfortunately, to the American public, who believed it for a while until, God bless her, Mary Tillman, the mother of Patrick Tillman, had fought, and after 5 investigations, the truth finally came out. So this has happened, and it's currently happening right now in a similar but a separate case involving 3 personnel from the Marine Special Operations Command, the same command I was in. We were involved in an incident in Iraq 43 months ago. A retired Army Green Beret contractor, 275-pound bodybuilder, was there in Iraq in Erbil and took 2 punches that hit a U.S. Marine gunnery sergeant in the face. He was coming in for an attempted 3rd strike, and one Marine stepped in to defend his other Marine buddy. So one gunny came in, punched the retired Green Beret in the face one time. He fell backwards, hit his head. They treated him medically instantly. There was no other punches, kicks, no weapons, no foul language. It was just that one punch. So there was a Navy Special Operation Corpsman that went to the same course that all Green Beret Corps medics and SEAL corpsmen go to there at Fort Bragg. He immediately treated him. They reported it. They brought him back to base. They medically evacuated him. He died a little bit less than 4 days later after this from complications of asphyxiating on his vomit. The so what on all this is all 3 men in the Marine Special Operations Command have been charged with homicide, to include the Marine that his involvement was being punched in the face twice, homicide, to include the Navy corpsman who did his very best to take care until he was properly relieved, and this former Green Beret who's surprisingly also at the time he was a contractor for Lockheed Martin, the nation's largest defense contractor, which our former chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Marine General Joe Dunford, works as a board member on. And so I know when there's a death, there's investigations. I just believe this went too far. Mark, just think if you, your family, or any of the listeners or viewers the larger implication is, if these Marines are convicted, we're surrendering our right of self-defense. If you're out with your family and somebody punches one of your children or your wife, do you not have the right to defend them? Marines are taught from boot camp that we have this program called the Marine Corps Martial Arts Program. And these Marines not just utilize that as they were trained, they use the minimum amount of force. Marines are also taught in boot camp, besides Marine Corps martial arts, that Marines only destroy what's necessary. Whether you move on to become a sniper in the Marines or a breacher, we try to use the minimum amount of force to defeat the threat. And that's what they did. So these Marines were surrounded by not just this assaulter that attacked one of them, but 7 of his buddies, used the minimum amount of force, and they're all 3 being charged right now. This is a current case. You can look up MARSOC, MARSOC 3, and read about this. You can read about how the Marine Corps, less than a year ago in November, sent a colonel, that's the second highest rank for a judge advocate, a Marine lawyer, from the Pentagon down to Camp Lejeune, threatened 8 of these Marine defense attorneys. All defense attorneys, all 8 of them, wrote sworn affidavits that this occurred. Just so happened to be one of the defense attorneys for these special operators was among this party, and so it compromised. I mean, when you have a Marine colonel, a very senior ranking lawyer, come down there and says, these high profile cases, you can be protected by your fitness report, your annual evaluation, but you will not be shielded, because when you go onto this promotion board, the senior Marine lawyer that sits on that board, that colonel will know the cases you're working on, and you will not be protected. So you're threatening someone's career, their livelihood, the quality of life they can provide for their family, for doing their job in defending someone. In America, as you know, Mark, and your listeners, we are a legal society based on laws. What it says under the apex of the Supreme Court, equal justice under law. We have laws that allow due process and the presumption of innocence, but when that is compromised by the unlawful command influence, which the Marine Corps, I saw a legal ruling yesterday that stated that this was not unlawful command influence, that the colonel didn't violate anything, and the case is continuing to this day. So you, in the Marine Corps, you can act like a thug, like in the mob. You can send a messenger. Somebody doesn't just coincidentally drive 5 hours south of the Pentagon from the Pentagon's legal judge advocate division and make their way down to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, to verbally threaten the careers of defense attorneys. That's not coincidental. Marines who are commissioned officers and are lawyers at the rank of colonel are not stupid. They will take risks, but that Marine colonel knew what he was doing. That wasn't some accidental, oop, my bad.
Just passing through, I figured I'd stop and say hello and threaten you.
Yeah, threaten a high-profile case. And, when the government has a weak case, and they also attempted, the prosecution in this case, just prior to that, to issue a gag order on them. The judge in the case threw it out. The judge happened to be, at that time, has been changed now, the judge was the defense attorney for the co-defendant in my case. So they did try to use a lot of these strong arm tactics. What I'm describing is nonfiction, just like the case that I wrote about in my book, A Few Bad Men. This is not something that happened in Tehran or Pyongyang. This happened in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Right. This current case with these 3 other special operators from the same command, Marine Special Operations Command, is currently going on at the same base in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, where we formerly had, not specifically that base, but we had witch hunt trials in American history. And but we've moved past that in America, or have we?
Yeah.
So when your rights as a U.S. citizen or military member for the presumption of innocence to be disregarded, we have some severe problems, and this needs to be addressed.
Who do you feel let you down more, the Marine Corps, the military in general, or do you think just government and politics was what overrode all of this?
That is a very, very good question. I do believe the Marine Corps, I had this Peter Pan moment. I loved the Marine Corps. And, certain things happened that, when I was a young Marine, everything I thought I saw was great. It was just what I wanted.
Right.
This organization has all these extremely strong morals. I thought this was just incredible. But leaders compromised those morals, and I was severely let down. This is occurring right now with these special operators. And when you have a problem like this, where morals and ethics are compromised by senior leaders and you don't intervene, it just like a criminal mind. I'm not some criminal justice major, but people, it emboldens them. They think they can get away with it again. And this has happened not just on this current case that's ongoing, it's happened in other cases. When you read the book, A Few Bad Men, you'll think this guy, Fred Galvin, is probably one of the dumbest guys that I know of, because after he was exonerated, he went right back and asked orders to go overseas, and he deployed to combat again. And then he stood up to his commanding officer, who dropped a 500-pound bomb. He wanted to, and he actually did go through with it, dropped a 500-pound bomb 34 meters away from his troops. I'm like, hey, we have other precision guided munitions. We have a 4 pounds of high explosive in this Griffin missile, or this Hellfire missile has 10 pounds of high explosives. These are shape charges, so they use overpressure to detonate and kill the enemy. We can drop these much closer. But no, I was his battalion operations officer. And not only, like I said, was I an instructor at the Marines version of Top Gun, but my duty there was to control aviation ordnance. So I'm the subject matter expert, not just only as a joint terminal attack controller, but as this uber fires guy who had done this over 2,000 times with live ordnance. And now we have a commander with no experience in aviation ordnance making these calls. That jet took off, so thank God it did not release any more ordnance on our own guys. But don't worry, that commanding officer then fired 2 surface fire rockets, these HIMARS rockets, 675 pounds each. Again, our Marines were 5 times inside the acceptable fratricide distance. The reason I bring this up is, his mind thinking that I can do whatever I want.
Yep.
So he relieved me when I questioned him and said, we can't do this. He fired me, sent me home, but he also prohibited all of these Marines that were affected by this shockwave. That energy goes through the soft tissue in your brain. And later, one of these Marines did hang himself, but he prohibited any of those Marines. There's a protocol for traumatic brain injury that if you're receiving an explosion like this, you have to sit out for 24 hours. You need to be assessed, even at the tactical level. But then when you return from that deployment, you need to be medically assessed for traumatic brain injury. But when a commander steps in and prohibits this, so in the military, we have policies, we have individuals when it comes to safety. So we have guardrails, we have guard dogs. And when those are taken out, when you disregard these policies, like for traumatic brain injury, and you disregard these policies and watchdogs, I came back from that deployment and I sent a sworn statement along with a polygraph that I took to 88 members of the Senate and House Armed Services Committee, my 2 Kansas U.S. senators, my district congressman from Kansas, the inspector general for the command that I worked with, the 3-star command. And after I did that on the 27th of November in 2011, I got this nice letter signed on Christmas Day, which was a Sunday. And as you know, Mark, 3-star officers in the Marine Corps or the military, you don't put a date on that letter unless it's the date that general officer signs that letter. It is reviewed. They have legal and administrative professionals that make sure everything's covered down. So I don't know what else would compel a general officer in Northern Virginia, deputy commandant for the Marine Corps, to go into his office on Sunday, on Christmas Day, less than a month after I do use protected communication to these members of Congress, which, as you know, those letters get also carbon copied to the Office of Legislative Affairs. So the service does fully receive that communication, which I didn't know at the time. So now I get this nice Christmas present, this letter signed by a 3-star. I'm still serving over in Okinawa, Japan, on the other side of the globe. For me, it's the 26th of December, but I get this letter signed by this general on the other side of the globe that I'm not in his direct chain of command, but I was making some noise, and I get ordered basically like the mob when a mobster gets handed a bat. And I know that 3-star general didn't know me from Adam, but he was told, get rid of this guy. So I went to another trial in Okinawa, called a board of inquiry. It's an involuntary separation board. They trumped up some charge that this was for substandard performance. I went in there. The Marine Corps has these evaluations called fitness reports that you get each year. There's a block in there that says performance. And even though that in my time, pardon my technical terms, but I have pissed people off in the military, but for performance, I've never been checked down that any of my performance. Now they've checked me down for judgment. Yeah. So, but when it comes to like the allegation of substandard performance, there was no evidence to support that. And so they dismissed that. And then I went on to continue to serve as the commanding officer at 1st Fleet Anti-Terrorism Security Team, 1st FAST out of Norfolk, Virginia. Our area responsibility was European and African theaters. A FAST team is similar to, like, it's essentially like a SWAT team for the Marine Corps. So every American embassy has Marines, that permanent presence. You can look at that persistent presence as like a black and white beat cop on walking the street doing his law enforcement, compared to a SWAT team that goes out when something is in duress. And one thing you said in your open, which I want to correct just slightly because it's not entirely how things are. So I did not personally deploy. We deployed a platoon, and it was actually the day after Benghazi fell. So that platoon provided what our mission is, to provide anti-terrorism security operations for any vital national or naval asset, which they held the Regional Affairs Office, and I know you know what that means, as well as American Embassy in Tripoli. They held those two buildings for 90 days before we turned those over to other U.S. forces. So, yes, I was then forced to retire in 2014 as I reached service limitations after 26 years, 10 months, and 19 days. And then I went on to start a small business, ran that for 5 years, returned to work for federal government for 4 years with the Interagency, Special Operations Command Pacific, and the Marine Corps. And now I work for Tesla.
I know you're tight on time. I just wanted to ask you one more thing. You know, if a few bad apples spoil the bunch, unfortunately for you, you seem to have run into several bad apples, at least in the senior positions and senior command along the way. Does that change your view of the Marine Corps itself, or is it just those individuals that you sort of, I don't know if harbor resentment's the right word, but, you know, you still have some angst with?
Yes, that's a really good question. So I still love the Marine Corps. I mean, obviously, as I just mentioned, I went back to serve 4 more years, which I've just recently left 4 months ago. The title of the book is not The Bad Marine Corps. It's not The Bad Pentagon or Department of Defense. It's A Few Bad Men, and that's really what it is. And you look at this and you're like, well, there's more than just a few, and that's true. You know, one of the Marine Corps slogans, we're looking for a few good men. Most people who are our age understand the movie that was based on a true story, A Few Good Men. But there were more than just a few. Just like in the story with Julius Caesar, it wasn't just Brutus that stabbed him in the back. It was all 69 senators. And the moral of the story is, this is a moral hazard that you have to deal with. You have to take immediate action. How do you do that? I've, on all these podcasts and interviews that allow the time, I always mention to the listeners, I'm not asking for any money at all. I think a lot of programs that do that, they're using it probably not how you want. But I'm asking for 5 minutes of your time to look up congress.gov/members, contact your member of Congress. If you want to figure out who to vote for, and if that member of Congress who you are represented by in the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives, if they don't give a constituent any time of day, by especially with any action, I mean, there's few things that our Constitution require that they provide for the general welfare and the national defense. And if one of those few specified tasks in our Constitution for our elected officials, if they don't give their constituents that put them in office the time of day right before an election, I think you know who not to vote for. Find someone who does care about our national defense and who will take action. And in these types of cases, especially with this ongoing case with MARSOC 3, a self-defense case, if they will not demand that a service chief comes into their office, I mean, these service chiefs, the military, we have elected officials which are guard dogs. And it's not, some of these people say, well, I'm not a member of the Senate or House Armed Services Committee. You don't have to be. We're not asking for a session to be held, but I would ask that these leaders be answered the tough questions, not some carefully crafted letter made by their attorney to pacify. I'm talking a face-to-face meeting with that commandant of the Marine Corps saying, what in the hell is going on in your command where a Marine who was attacked, I'm not talking about the guy that punched, but just the Marine who is attacked is charged with homicide? Yeah. I mean, are you out of your mind? The corpsman in the Marine Corps, I'm sure it's the same way as in the Army. You go after a medic or a corpsman, the doc that's there to save people's lives. That's one of the few things that
it's counter to regular thought process, right? It's so counter that it doesn't add up, and I think that's part of the sort of lack of justice in this case, or at least lack of obvious sort of ways to deduce how things would normally go. There would have to be a lot of predetermined thought for a medic to go into a situation and go, no, I'm going to let this individual die, or I'm going to aid in this individual dying, because it's counter to everything that they've learned. So there is all that. Look, I know you have to run because Elon Musk calls, but I could talk to you for hours. Honestly, I could. There's so much more here. I encourage you all to check out the book, A Few Bad Men. It's available wherever books are sold. Fred, I thank you so much for just being open and honest with me and being willing to share your story. I'd love to have you back on and do this again sometime to get to some more finer details of this, but certainly appreciate your time. And Fred Galvin, thanks for being part of the Hazard Ground.
Yes, thank you very much, sir. Have a great day.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground podcast, hosted by Mark Zinno. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at producer@hazardground.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.